This is version B, practice EOC or EOG, most missed questions. Let's see what we got. The oldest moon rocks have been dated to a time shortly after the estimated date of the formation of our solar system. Approximately how old are these moon rocks? Well, the Earth, the moon, the solar system, all of it is about 4.6 billion years old. So the answer is B. That is a fact. That is something you need to remember. A lot of questions on the EOG are not going to be fact-based questions where you can just remember a fact and answer it. This question from SchoolNet is a fact question. You just needed to know that fact. Okay. Next question that a lot of people missed. The graph shows the distribution of the freshwater resources of Earth. This is something we talked a lot about, and I am telling you, put giant stars by this in your brain. You need to know the water's distribution on Earth. Okay? 97% of all water on Earth is salt water. We cannot drink that. That means 3% is fresh. And of that 3%, about 70% of it is frozen. Ice caps and glaciers. Can't drink that either. About a third of the fresh water, remember this is only fresh water that we're talking about in this pie chart, is groundwater. That we can drink if we can get it out of the ground. And the remaining fraction of a percent is going to be surface water, like lakes, rivers, and ponds. Okay? Which of these sources of fresh water corresponds to source number 1? This right here. Okay? So source number 1 is about 70% of the fresh water. So that is going to be frozen water, ice caps, and glaciers. Okay? So you got to know that one. Okay, that is a big deal. It will be on your EOG. Next, most missed version B question. Which would lead to the greatest reduction of dissolved oxygen in a lake? Now, we discussed in the other video that the amount of dissolved gases, in this case dissolved oxygen, goes up when temperature goes down. And dissolved oxygen, or any other gas, would go down when the temperature goes up. So that's why you don't want your fish tank to get too hot, or your pond, or your ocean. Which would lead to the greatest reduction in dissolved oxygen? DO is dissolved oxygen. Decreased number of fish in the lake. Well, fewer fish, that means they're not using the oxygen, so that would cause an increase in dissolved oxygen. So it's not that one. Increased number of fish. Increased number of fish in the lake. More fish would use more oxygen, so that would cause a decrease, so maybe. We always read all the answer choices because we want the best answer. Increased nutrients and algal blooms. All right, now, more nutrients means that your lake goes from having a right amount of algae at the top to having a crazy number of algae at the top. So much algae, it may cover the top and make it harder to see anything in the pond or the lake or the whatever. So you say, oh, what's the big deal there? It's just algae, it just floats on the water. Well, when these increased nutrients are used up, all this algae cannot survive. It doesn't have enough food or enough nutrients. So it starts dying. And when it starts dying, it's going to die and fall down to the bottom. And down at the bottom, it decays. And the bacteria that break down the algae and the plants and the dead things at the bottom of the ocean, they use oxygen. They're aerobic. So that means that you're going to have oxygen being used up in this decay process. So increased nutrients in algal blooms lead to a decrease in dissolved oxygen. That sounds like a really good answer so far. Let's read the last one. Decreased number of plants surrounding the lake. That directly is not going to have a problem. However, it could lead to more erosion and turbidity and problems. But this is going to be the best answer. Increased nutrients. Oh, by the way, increased nutrients, especially if humans cause it, is called eutrophication. Okay, eu means beyond, troph means nutrient, and ication means process. So eutrophication is the process of having nutrients beyond what you should normally have. So eutrophication leads to an algal bloom. Algal blooms lead to decay at the bottom, and that uses up oxygen. How are the atoms of sodium and chlorine arranged in the compound sodium chloride? All right, so first of all, sodium is an element. Chlorine is an element. That's a Cl, not a Ci. All right? And so sometimes some people will write it like that with a cursive L to make it a little clearer. But so sodium and chlorine are elements. They can combine. You may remember from an earlier talk that sodium loses one electron, and chlorine wants to gain one electron. These two are a match made in heaven, because the sodium loses the electron, becomes positive, chlorine gains the electron, becomes negative, and that forms sodium chloride. One sodium atom per chlorine atom. There's an invisible subscript 1 and an invisible subscript 1 for each of those. Sodium ions and chloride ions are connected to one another by a single bond. Well, that sounds good so far. Sodium ions and chloride ions are connected to one another by a double bond. Definitely not. Sodium ions and chlorine ions swirl around one another in a solution of water. No. So the best answer there is A. Okay? They're only gaining or losing one electron, so that's a single bond. All right? All right, why is protein an important part of a healthy diet? So the first thing we need to think here is amino acids. Amino acids form protein. And protein forms enzymes. Enzymes are biological catalysts. They speed up chemical reactions. They put things together and take things apart. They form some hormones or proteins. That's H. They form tissues or help form tissues. The platelets in your bloodstream that help clot your blood. Proteins do a whole bunch of stuff for you. But in order for your body to make protein, you must consume amino acids, which means eating protein. So is protein needed to change glucose to energy? Well, there are some enzymes involved in that process. This would be cellular respiration. So that could be the answer. It sounds a little iffy, though. It doesn't sound like the best answer. So let's keep reading. It is needed to store nutrients. No. There are some nutrients that are fat soluble. So maybe fat helps store nutrients, but not protein. It is needed to repair tissue. Now that sounds pretty good. It is needed to produce water. All you need to make water is hydrogen and oxygen and a little bit of energy to get them to interact. So no. So the best answer is C. We need protein to help repair tissues. Now you notice with this question how I started with a brain dump. A lot of these questions, I start with a brain dump. Write down anything you can think of about that topic, and a lot of times that helps you focus your thought and find the correct answer, or at least eliminate wrong answers so you have a better chance. All right, moving on. Which is the best method for preventing a parasitic disease? Remember, parasitic disease. So that means you have a host that the parasite feeds off of. It harms the host in order to survive. Malaria is a parasite. Ticks are a parasite. Fleas are a parasite. Tapeworms in your intestines, that is a parasite. Heartworms in your dog's or cat's heart, that would be a parasite. So vaccination, maybe, but vaccinations are mainly for a virus. Wearing a mask, maybe. Most parasites are not airborne, though. Limiting physical contact with others. Again, most parasites don't spread from touch, so I don't know about that one. Avoiding contaminated food and water. Ding, 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 ding. All right, avoiding contaminated food and water means that the food or the water have the virus or the bacteria or the amoeba or the paramecium that is the parasite and causes you to get sick. So if you avoid the contaminated food, you don't get the parasite and you don't get sick. Okay? 23. In the Midwestern United States, the occurrence of influenza was greater than expected, which best describes the influenza outbreak. It was a pandemic because influenza is an infectious disease. An epidemic because influenza is an infectious disease. A pandemic because it occurred in more than one state. Talking about the Midwestern United States. So that sounds like more than one state to me. An epidemic because it occurred in one region of the United States. All right, so now I've read that. I'm going to go back and reread everything again, because whenever I get a question and there's a lot of words, sometimes it confuses me. So I need to read it more than once. Okay? All right. So Midwestern United States, more than one, it's plural. The occurrence of influenza was greater than expected, which best describes the influenza outbreak. Well, it could be an infectious disease, could be an epidemic or a pandemic. So it says states, so it's plural, more than one state. So it's not an epidemic. It could be a pandemic, depending on the scale you're looking at. If you're looking at from more than one state, maybe it's a pandemic. Nowadays, most pandemics are considered when it goes from one country to another country. So now we've eliminated B. Let's look at C and D. A pandemic because it occurred in more than one state. That sounds promising. An epidemic because it occurred in one region of the United States. Again, that's a possibility, but the best answer is going to be C. It is a pandemic because it crossed borders from one state to the next state. And I know some of you are thinking, well, then it could be A. Why is it A the answer? Well, here's the deal. Infectious diseases can be an epidemic or a pandemic. These two just aren't specific enough, right? So that takes us to D, an epidemic, because it occurred in one region of the United States. No. If it's a whole region of the United States, that is probably a pandemic. Remember, epidemics are local outbreaks, pandemics cross borders. All right, so that is version B, EOG practice, most missed questions. Hope you learned something. Stay curious. See you later.